So just a couple of quick starting points, and if you've looked at some of the video resources that are out there, you might already know this, but when it comes to the comparison, it is not about showing separate kind of areas. I've already said this. Your paragraphs need to be discussing both texts, and you should actually be taking every opportunity to be discussing both texts at the same time, because that's comparison. If you get on one stream where you're just talking about one text for 500 words, that's a missed opportunity because you're not comparing during that. So the focus is to show that comparative analysis. Comparing means having two elements side by side and going back and forth between the two. And comparison is also about highlighting similarities and differences. Okay, so it's not just like, oh, that's the same, that's the same, that's the same, that's the same. That's not kind of an interesting discussion. There should be elements that are similar and elements that are different. Okay, so maybe the idea is similar, but the way the idea, the techniques used are used differently. Okay, or maybe the content or the representation or the outcome is different. Maybe the problem is the same, but the resolution is different. Okay, so think a little bit about that in terms of your paragraphs to make sure you've got that interest. You should not be writing separate paragraphs on each text. That's not a comparison. However, you do not have to include both texts in every sentence. And we're going to kind of get to that because some people almost overdo it. You can overkill where you're sort of like bang, 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 and it's like a roller coaster. So we're talking about structure for that reason. So I want to take you through this idea of this structure, okay? And I guess the easiest way to get your head around what you should be doing in each section is by looking at a structure. Now I'm going to show you sort of what the structure looks like and what an example of writing in that structure looks like. But then I'm also going to go on to show what does a more sophisticated version of that look like, okay? Because what we sort of find, something I always say when it comes to teaching writing is that good writers know the rules. Okay, they know the importance of structure, clarity, everything along that line. Great writers have the ability to bend and break the rules in order to strengthen what they're trying to say. You know what I mean? Okay, so that'll be one of the differences I'm going to show you between the structure we're going to look at initially and sort of some of the things in the A+ sample. Okay, so let's have a bit of a look at this. There's all kinds of structures out there, and you might have learned this one before, or you might have learned different ones. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to sort of talk to this one, just to illustrate what I mean when I say back and forth and what I mean when I say comparison. So this is teal structure, you know, with 3 E's and an L, which we can't see down the bottom. But the idea of this one is that the topic sentence, like, on your plan, as you know, you've got at the beginning the idea. Okay, what's the idea or the theme? Now that's the most important thing to start with. Okay, so your paragraph always needs to establish that first. Okay, it's sort of the why, and then going down, how is that communicated and where is that communicated? And this is sort of what this structure is all about. The topic sentence states the idea that will be discussed. So traditionally, you know, the most important thing to make sure you get out is your idea. The elaboration elaborates on how the idea is communicated through techniques. Okay, so that's usually, or if we're following a structure, that might be where you mention the technique. That might be where you mention that it's characterization or symbolism or setting or narrative perspective or something along that line. But it goes a little bit further, that it elaborates on the idea. Okay, so you might, you know, kind of hint at what the idea is here, but then you kind of take it that little bit further when you talk about how and why. Okay, this is your evidence. Okay, and we're going to zoom in on this a little bit later on. This is probably, in some ways, the most complex part of the comparison because there's so much information in that. This will be your biggest area. And the effect is sort of, this outlines, you know, that bigger picture. This is where we talked about in Fahrenheit, we talked about the resolution to the idea, you know. So sometimes an idea can pose a problem, whereas this is like, what do we take away from that idea? Yeah? How do we interpret that idea? How does it change us? How do we grow from it? Where's our critical thinking around this? So this is kind of where the real money is in terms of what you draw from it. And then the linking statement is just important. I can see it's not quite playing ball on the screen here. Hello? Oh, there we go. Come back. The linking statement is really just about, at the end of every paragraph, you want to make sure that you've brought people back to what it is you're actually trying to do. It's not about, so here, a rookie mistake is thinking that at the end of the paragraph you sort of link to the next paragraph you're going to talk to. That's not the case. Okay, paragraphs should be self-contained in what they're trying to employ. Don't muddy the waters of that, but you should always sort of finish by relating it back to the overall question that you're actually trying to answer. Is that fair? Okay, so this is a traditional structure, and we'll have a look at what that looks like. The key thing to kind of take aside here is this. All sections, okay, so it's not about sentences here, all right? It's not about you have to go backwards and forwards every sentence, but each section should have reference to both texts, and it should incorporate comparative language. So this is going to be like a tick box we're going to kind of go through, okay, and we'll look at this, like, does it make reference? So I can't just talk about sort of the idea of one text and then move on without also sort of mentioning the role of the other text in that function. Does that make sense? Okay, so we'll see some examples of that in just a second. Just really quickly, I mentioned this to you earlier on, but just what is comparative language? Well, there's just a list of things here, and there's more. I just grabbed, you know, the top 5 or the top however many of what I mean when I say comparative language. So if you're talking about a similarity between two texts, I should see things like this. Okay, and if you're talking about a difference, I might see something like this. Okay, some of them are really obvious, like on the other hand, but other ones, like terms like while or despite, can often be quite subtle. Yeah. Okay, but you know, so saying blah 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 while blah 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 is a contrasting statement. All right. So let's see some of this stuff in action. Okay, so what does it look like? So your first point, I just want to talk about the beginning, of like how you're going to start your paragraphs, okay? Start by making the ideas that will be covered clear, okay? Because that's the guts of it, that's your interpretation, that's what you're looking at and talking about. So here I've got both of Mice and Men and the Shawshank Redemption illustrate the positive benefit of hope. Yeah? Now I've mentioned, so that's my topic sentence, yeah? In my 5 stages of structure, that's one. Okay, so we do this kind of, have I mentioned both texts? Yes. Okay, good. Because if I only mention one, then I'm already kind of stuffing up my comparison. Have I used comparative language? Yes. And have I illustrated whether it's a similarity or a difference? It's a similarity. Okay, I use the word both to indicate that this element is similar. If I go down here, has the idea been identified? Yes? Okay. So the purpose, in terms of that structure, I've ticked the boxes of how I should be starting a paragraph. Okay? If the answer to any of these is no, then I've stuffed something up. Fair enough? Okay? You might find that your ideas are not necessarily the same. So here's a more complicated version. While each text relays the importance of freedom to the individual, of Mice and Men suggests that freedom is ultimately compromised by the corruption of others, whereas the Shawshank Redemption sees freedom as a means to overcome corruption. Okay. Have I mentioned both texts? Yes. Have I included comparative language? Yes. Okay, so, and you can see it in here like while. Notice like there's no on the other hand or anything like that. It's quite subtle, but you can see while and whereas. Okay, that's my, that's my comparative language. Okay, if there's no comparative language, then I'm not comparing and I'm missing the point. Have the ideas been identified? Yeah? So the ideas don't have to be the same, but I can't move on until I've made the ideas clear, because that's going to set up the rest of my discussion. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So the second step, so that's really, structurally, that's how you should be starting your paragraph. Get the idea on the table. Here's where I'm going with this. This is what's important, because that's going to link into your effect and your ultimate discussion and conclusion, and that's what we're interested in. Okay. It's not like paint by numbers. And that's why, when we talked about setting questions before, your question really orientates towards ideas rather than techniques in this case. Like rather than saying, how has blah blah used symbolism, sometimes that can muddy the waters by making the topic sentence all about the technique and not focusing on the idea. And that's sort of just cut and dry sort of stuff. We've mentioned when you're analysing a film, we're not really interested in you just going through and saying, that's a close-up, that's a wide shot, that's a long shot, that's dense, that's not so dense. You know, what you're doing there is you're listing and you're showing your understanding, but if you're not talking about why and how and the ideas behind it, then you're not analysing. Cool? Alright, so getting the techniques right. So here we go. So now I'm on my next section. Everyone okay with this? I started with this idea, I was at the topic sentence to start with, and now I'm at what's called the elaboration. So there's two things I want to do here. I want to introduce what the technique is, okay, because it's no point sharing my evidence until I've established what type of evidence I'm actually going to be showing, okay? And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to expand on what I mean by an idea, okay? So you can see here, within each text, the authors similarly draw on the setting to illustrate how a person's circumstances can overcome their personal resolve. Okay? So notice, like in my topic sentence before, like if I sort of just go back up here to the topic sentence, I talked about the benefit of hope. That was sort of the idea that I hinted at. Everyone kind of see that? Okay, I shouldn't draw on this because I'll be moving up and down. Yeah, but I said benefit of hope, but I'm not, you know, we're not completely clear of what that means, are we? Like it gives us an idea about what the conversation's going to be about, but the elaboration is all about sort of pulling that apart in a little bit more detail. So when I came down here, okay, within each text, the authors similarly draw on the setting to illustrate how a person's circumstances can overcome their personal. Well, that's what I'm talking about, the benefit of hope. Okay, but you notice how I've sort of linked it more clearly to the technique. So we do our check. Have I mentioned both texts? Have I used comparative language? Okay. Have the techniques been identified? Has the idea been elaborated on? Okay. Tick, 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 tick. I can move on. Yeah? If it's no to any of those, I've stuffed something up. Yeah, so just notice as I'm moving down the structure, I have to make sure I'm comparing on each level. So it's not about sentences, it's about have I done it in this section. So we jump down here. So just like above, the techniques don't have to be the same. Alright, so here's another one. Despite featuring similar ideas, each text delivers its intended message through differing techniques. As Steinbeck communicates the importance of holding on to dreams in times of desperation through the symbolism of the dream, while Darabont covers the redeeming power of hope through the characterisation of Andy Dufresne. Okay, so longer, but does it follow the same formula? Have I mentioned both texts? Okay, this is going to be maddening for you, I know, because I'm just repeating this, but this is what you have to say. Have I used comparative language? Okay, you can see like despite, okay, while. You know, now this is contrasting language in this case. Have the techniques been identified? Have the ideas been elaborated on? Okay. Can everyone sort of see? So like I said, if you're sort of starting with like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to start, I don't know how to get words on the page, okay, this is just a simple sort of structure, sort of formula to make sure that you are getting the information on the page clearly, functionally, and comparatively. Everyone okay with that so far? Seems manageable? No one's freaking out? Okay. So now let's talk about, so if you've got your idea of that structure, okay, good. That could be today's lesson, okay? I'm going to work to that structure. I'm going to make sure I'm getting my stuff on the page, I'm following that sequence. But what does an A-level student do with this, okay? So what do we start to notice at A level? Okay, so students who really start to show that refined precision and that kind of real strength. So here's the example. At the higher level, students see structures and sections as more clunky. You know, so you might have noticed, I'm going through the ropes here, but there were probably areas where I was either, I could have included extra pieces as I was going, or I could have led into things with a little bit more detail, you know, that kind of thing. So often when we start writing, it can be a bit clunky and mechanical, And good writers often find more concise ways to establish similar information. So here's the A+ sample. This is how that student started one of their paragraphs. The setting of both Lord of the Flies and The Dark Knight exaggerates this moral conflict, as each rely on the physical location coupled with the symbolic value of each respective setting in order to emphasise the connection between civilization and savagery. Okay. So where before I sort of had these two sections, I wonder what we can see in this one. Are both texts mentioned? Yes. Okay. Is comparative language used? Yes. Has the idea been established and elaborated on? So notice at the beginning here they say this moral conflict, exaggerate this moral conflict. Okay, but they don't really, we get the sense that there's this theme or this focus on morality here, but we don't quite see what that is. But down here, they emphasise the connection between civilization and savagery. So we sort of see, they start by kind of showing how it's connected, but then they take it to that deeper level at the end of the paragraph. So they've done that. Has the technique been identified? Yes. Okay. So here's the guts of it, this student sort of compacted these two areas we just talked about, kind of almost into one sentence. Right? So they've sort of, and you even notice the way that it starts, I don't think it's, out of memory, it's not actually the first paragraph, it might be the second. So it's sort of, the flow of it, it doesn't sort of start with that it doesn't start like a new kind of element, it's got that flow to it. So they've already been talking about other things and then they've gone straight into the next paragraph, but they've still done all those important foundational things that we need to see. Okay, does that make sense? Now the benefit for them in this case is that it means that because they covered this stuff more concisely, they get into their sort of evidence discussion sort of element quicker. Okay, and do you remember me saying that to you with the Fahrenheit kind of thing? Remember there was a number of you who kind of had those sentences that were like, Bradbury uses a number of ideas in order to get his point across. The ideas are portrayed through, and to you I would have said, look, forget that, just get into it. Do you remember me saying that? Like get a sentence to get you on the right track and then get into it. Because the guts of this is really the value. So where is the value? The greatest value for this task is actually found in the most complex part of your analysis. And that's when we want to see you drawing together evidence, quotes and ideas to draw out complex interpretations. Often the first thing, like the topic sentence and the elaboration, are really just pointing out things. Yeah? It's like saying this idea is in here and this technique is in here. But there's no discussion of evidence or proof or complexity or anything like that. So in terms of the value, it's important to set that up. But what we really want to see is this. Okay, so good writers are sort of able to get into the guts of this as quick as they can. It's a similar thing I've said to you before, that we are caring less and less about introductions. We don't want this big waffly sort of introduction that's like, what is literature? Is literature our gateway to the ideas of the world? Like, that stuff's often really just fluffy and you can sort of BS your way through it. When really we just want quite a concise, functional introduction so that you can get into the real stuff quicker. Everyone cool with that? Okay, a couple of years ago it might have been a different story, but this is kind of where we're getting, okay? With time, this stuff gets more refined, more polished. Moderators and examiners get more kind of fixed on what they want to see. These are people who are reading thousands of essays, so getting into that kind of deeper stuff quicker is showing the complexity of your understanding quicker, okay? And the more of it, the better. So keep that in mind. All right, so what does this mean? So I want to talk to you a little bit about evidence now, okay? I'll just give you this to start, okay? I might need to go back a notch on that, just so you can see. Okay. So, I've taken two texts in this example. I have taken Fahrenheit 451 and Arlington Road, the two texts that we have studied. Okay? And I've written this. Now, this isn't a paragraph. Okay? This is evidence. Yeah? So this is kind of jumping straight into my evidence. So we've talked about these two sections, and now we're talking about evidence. Okay? I'm getting straight into it. Bradbury illustrates the deteriorating effect of conformity through Mildred, whose compliance to the demands of society has left her burnt by chemicals, her body as thin as a praying mantis from dieting, illustrating how the desire to please others over the care of oneself is ultimately destructive. Oh, what a big sentence. Who remembers, when we did Fahrenheit, who remembers what we talked about in terms of sentences? What do we want, what don't we want? We don't want simple sentences, that's right, we want complex sentences. Great. Simple sentences are often just really short, concise, one piece of information. It's a waste of your writing. Okay? So we want complex sentences. What kind of sentence don't we want to see? You know, some of you suffered in this in Fahrenheit, particularly in the formative activities. What was I saying? Nah, don't want to see it. Get rid of that. That's got no value. Summary sentences. Okay? So if your sentence has nothing but summary in it, then it's not analysis and it's a waste of your time. Okay? I took this from someone's draft. This was some feedback I gave to one of our students. But we covered this a little bit as well. But a formula to use in your sentence construction is this. Okay? So think about these elements. The evidence, of course, is what happens in the book, okay, or what happens in the text. So that is important because you don't want to be kind of talking about things that aren't connected to the book. So evidence is important, but connection is also important. What does this actually mean in regards to the question or the bigger picture of what you're trying to say? Okay? If you just talk about this, then that's a summary sentence and it's got no value. Okay? So you need the evidence and the connection, but the other thing you should have in there is that quote, which substantiates your evidence. Okay? Now, if you're using a film, it might not be a quote, it might be a description of a particular element of the film, or a particular scene, or a particular shot, or something along that line, and I'll show you an example in just a second. Does that make sense? So this was the example, okay, so you've got two sentences here. Clarice is presented as a highly individual character due to her social nature. Okay, so here I'm talking about what happens in the book. Okay, so that's green, that's evidence. Okay, if that was a full stop, you know, I sort of haven't necessarily, I've commentated on the book, but I haven't sort of made any deeper connection as to what that means and why it's relevant. So then I go into blue, I'm on the same sentence. Bradbury uses her character as a means of showing the value of individualism over conformity. Okay, but how do you know that any of this stuff is actually in the book or actually true? Well, to substantiate with a quote. Yeah, that's a really strong sentence because it has those three elements in there. While Clarice is rejected by her society and considered to be an odd one, okay, so you notice like, and I've integrated my quote into there to substantiate what I'm talking about, but the green, like that's what happens in the book. Clarice is a reject. Okay, who cares? She's not real. Okay, so connection is important. We see that her acceptance of her differences have ultimately resulted in a greater self-satisfaction and happiness. So I commentate on actually what does she represent, what's the connection. Does that make sense? Everyone okay? So there's two sentences, but this is sort of showing, now this is one text, okay? So I'm showing the kind of density of discussion. So let's go back to my previous example. So I say here try to get this balance across your discussion and your analysis will immediately become more targeted and relevant. That's what I said to someone in the previous assessment. Let's go back to this, okay? Whoa. Can I fit it all on one screen? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, here we go. I fit that, yeah. I might just have to scroll a little bit. You might be able to see it on your screen, but notice how I've colour-coded it in the same thing, but this is comparative. And I've used an extra colour, and that colour is purple, and that colour represents what?
Comparative language.
Comparative language, okay? Great. So, same thing, so connection. I started with connection here. Bradbury illustrates the deteriorating effect of conformity. So that's kind of my idea, that's my why, okay? And I've gone straight into then my evidence through Mildred, whose compliance to the demands of society has left, straight into my quote, integrated quote, substantiating that what I'm saying is actually in the book, and now I've gone to the connection, illustrating how the desire to please others over the care of oneself is ultimately destructive. Okay, can you see how, like, in this section up here, I've got those three elements? You see that? Okay, so now I'm jumping to my other text. All right, so this was text 1, okay, this was Fahrenheit. Now I'm jumping to my other text. So this is how the evidence is more complicated than when you were just doing one text. Notice the last one I gave you 2 sentences, one after the other, but they were both about the same text. I'm jumping here, okay? So I've done this, now I'm going to jump across. Pellington offers similar deterioration in Michael Faraday, who is shown to become more isolated from those around him, though in this case, okay, comparative language, it is his defiance to conformity that has caused his separation. Now notice the green, I'm just talking about Michael, I'm talking about what he does. I haven't sort of connected that yet to what that means. While seemingly normal at the beginning, Michael's growing paranoia around Oliver Lang. Now notice the red here is different, and I wanted to illustrate this to you because I know a lot of you are thinking, well, how do I get my film sort of techniques in here? So notice my red up here is my quotes, and when you're doing a book, you've sort of got the benefit to be able to grab quotes, don't you? You know, because everything is communicated through language. Not always the case in film. So I did this to show you, so it results in increasing darkness, which symbolises his deterioration, resulting in the latter scenes of the film cloaking Michael in shadow, his face weary and exhausted. So do you notice how I wasn't able to bring a quote out of the film to substantiate what it was to say. I'm talking about visual elements, so I've described those, but they act as my red in this section. Does that make sense? Okay, and then if I sort of duck down here, Pellington uses the changing representation of Michael to illustrate how the pursuit of an individual endeavour without the support of others can be equally damaging. So notice when I say equally, that kind of links to what I said up there. So the guts of this, everyone, is, and you'll notice here, like it's not an exact science. Like I put a full stop here because if I tried to add that into the same sentence, what would I have? You know, I'd have a mouthful. Okay, but what you can see is that I've made those 3 elements really clear. I've talked about what happens in the text, I've substantiated it, and I've connected it before I move on. Yeah? I definitely shouldn't be, I shouldn't have green for one text followed by green for another text. Can you imagine that? You know? Like in Fahrenheit 451, Montag is the main character and he burns books. You know, similarly, in Fahrenheit 451, Michael is paranoid of his neighbour. Yeah? If I'm just sort of talking about content versus content with no connection, then I'm missing the deeper level. So I shouldn't be moving on from any evidence or any content until I've made it relevant, and then I can jump to my other text. Everyone cool on that? All right. So this just summarises what we're at. In our novel study, we did a lot of work around the structure of a sentence. We should not have sentences that are purely summary, okay? You should be going through with a fine-tooth comb, okay? And you remember, I'm not going to highlight them for you in this task, okay? But I might say in your feedback, there's a lot of summary in here. There's a lot of sentences that are just telling us what happened in the book and nothing else. And following that feedback, guess what you're going to have to do? Go through sentence by sentence and see if you can find them and get rid of them, okay? You should not have sentences that are just quotes. You know, try and integrate your quotes. Now, I know some quotes and things can be quite long, so that's not an exact rule, but just be really mindful that your quotes shouldn't just sort of sit on their own, and you definitely shouldn't have a sentence that just says, an example of this is in the quote, full stop. You know, so the purpose of that sentence was to introduce the quote. Quotes should be integrated. You know what I mean? Okay, they should just happen where we need them. You should never have to say, we see this on page 261, line 17. Okay, I don't care, get straight into it, okay? We should not have sentences that make claims without evidence. So similarly, when I showed you the connection before, I can't just say this without linking it to what's in the book or in the film. Okay? Yeah? That's just that's a fluffy, that's a speculation with no evidence. Okay? So I also can't just say, Ray Bradbury, uses his book in order to criticise our obsession with technology. In a similar way, and sort of move on, because I haven't substantiated it. I'm just sort of talking out my bum, really. So just be really conscious of that. We need to tie our information together. Just a quick point about evidence structure, okay? Remember, we've talked a lot about this word, haven't we? Yeah, evidence is all about this. It's about logic, okay? So remember the work we've done so far in both Arlington Road and Fahrenheit about establishing logic. If I want to show that something has happened as a result of a change, I need to show that change. If I want to show that something is negative, I have to show that before that thing appeared, things were positive. Like this guy was doing really well, and then when this person came into their life, afterwards we could see the person was not doing very well, so therefore this is negative. You know what I mean? Okay? That's logic. But logic can take slightly different forms in this. And here's two structures just to illustrate that. Okay? Structure one might look like this. So I show, and I'm using characterization as an example. Okay? But maybe I show the character at the beginning, and I use what I just talked about. I use my evidence, my connection, and my quotes to show them at the beginning versus them at the end. And then I sort of show that growth. This illustrates. And then I go on to text two and show the beginning, show the end, and show the growth. Okay? Now that's okay. Yeah, that's a perfectly fine structure because in our kind of circumstance here, when we're talking about teal, we're up to this point where we're talking about evidence. But even though these two things might be separate, in that section, I'm still mentioning both texts. I'm still showing, comparative language. You know what I mean? That being said, depending on your content, it might work better to structure it like this, where you talk about how the character was at the beginning and what this establishes for us, versus what the character was at the beginning of the other text and what this establishes. And then talking about the character at the end versus the character at the end, and then showing the growth in text 1 and 2. Okay? Now obviously this is a more comparative kind of element, and where you can, it's great to sort of make those connections, but it sort of depends, doesn't it, on what you're talking about and the clarity of what you're talking about. So what I sort of want to just to illustrate through this is you are not required to go sentence to sentence to sentence to sentence. And in some cases, flipping back and forwards too much can be disorientating when we're trying to get a sense of what you're actually trying to build together. So some of the feedback I might give to some of you in your draft is you're just kind of flicking, backwards and forwards too quickly, and you're not establishing or building a point clearly. You should actually look to kind of compare less and make deeper connections before moving on, okay? So don't take, some teachers will tell you this, like, I want you to be going back, and it's a good thing to sort of teach when you look at, middle school and stuff like that, but there's overkill. Okay, everyone cool with that? But where you see a good opportunity to logically create a comparative construction of ideas, go for it, okay? It all comes down to, so this key point, what have I, and you can see this kind of written here, but I've said this to you, the most important ingredient of good writing is
this is going well.
good writing. Clarity, okay? Doesn't matter how fancy you write, doesn't matter how good your vocabulary is, doesn't matter how many synonyms and big words you use, if it's not clear, it's not good. Okay, everyone cool on that? If it's not clear, it's not good. We've mentioned the fact that one of the biggest dangers for people in Fahrenheit and in this one was writing in too convoluted a way. Do you remember I've said that before? I can see that you are trying to use all of these great big words and weave all of these things together. but I'm not following what you're saying. It's too convoluted. Why didn't you just tell me what you meant? Okay? So clarity is key. At the end of the day, if it's not clear, you got nothing. Okay? So keep that in mind. So choose the structure that best suits the content that you are discussing and think about what is going to be more clear. Okay? That should always be like, oh, Mr. Brown, I'm thinking I could do this way or I could do that way, and I'm weighing up what's going to be the best, what's going to get me the most marks. I want to show my comparison, all this stuff. Okay, all right, stop. What's going to be most clear to the person who's reading it? Oh, well, it would definitely make more sense if it was like this. Do it that way. You know what I mean? Okay, so that's kind of what this is all about. Now, if we just go down here, okay, this is the last point I'm going to make with you, okay? The difference in terms of kind of, when we talk about, I guess, the standard of work, I write here, it's all in the details. It really is, it's all in the details. You might have watched the video that I've posted about structure, and if you're still not sure about comparative structure, watch that video. Now, spoiler alert, that video was created for a Year 9 class. Okay, so this is me teaching comparison to a Year 9 class. And this is an example of a Year 9 paragraph. Okay, it was written by a Year 9 student. Okay, it's got all the structure in place though. It's got the topic sentence. Does it mention both texts? Yes. Does it use comparative language? Yes. Does it show us what the idea is? Yes. Second one, does it show us the technique? Yes. Does it elaborate? Yes. Does it use comparative language? Yes. Yeah? So the difference really between a Year 9 paragraph, like you can see they're doing all it, like comparatively, this is perfectly structured. They've done a fantastic job. They go backwards and forwards, they draw things together, it's great. Okay? The difference between a Year 9 paragraph and a Year 12 paragraph is not in the structure or the approach to comparison, it's all in the details. Okay, so if I go down here, this is my example paragraph. Okay, the first thing you'll notice is that it is longer. Okay, you'll notice that where I could fit, and I know it's double spaced, but where I could fit all my evidence kind of in here for my Year 9 paragraph, my evidence here, you know, as long as I'm integrating quotes. Yeah, I'm kind of refining ideas. I'm refining my language. I'm backing things up and substantiating. There's more complexity here. Like my effect has more complexity to it. Okay, the ideas I'm bringing out, the language I'm using, greater vocabulary, more sophistication. Structure, exactly the same. Okay, everyone cool on that? All right. And the last one, so I put then here, this is the A+ paragraph, and just bear with me because it's got a gap in it because I sort of had to take a picture over 2 pages. But again, like what are we really seeing? Well, in a lot of ways it's longer, okay? But interestingly enough, like as I mentioned, this one here takes this many words to get into that point where I said that's where the value is. Do you remember me saying that? Okay. This one here uses its first sentence and then it's ended. Okay. So even though their sizes are relatively the same, this guy gets into the weaving of information much quicker, which means if I kind of, if I'm drawing the paragraphs sort of like, one's here and they're the same size, but the value is different, okay? So one sort of like might have, let's just say that much value, whereas one might have that much value because they got into it quicker, you know what I mean? Okay? So just be really mindful of that. Again, depending on the grade you're going for, you should be looking, if you haven't already, you should be looking at these things. And I would go as far as to having them almost next to you, sort of while you're composing your first go at. Okay? Because you want to constantly be moving and you don't just want to be looking at a blank screen and saying, what do I write? So think about, well, how did this person sort of construct, how did this example get its message or get its ideas across? Okay, great. I'm going to frame mine in a similar sort of structure. You know what I mean? Okay. Just in terms of the writing of it, as I've mentioned before, starting with a more structured approach is probably a good way to go about it. Sometimes if you jump straight into this, you're in more risk of it just turning into a hot mess, you know, where you've sort of tried to do all of this stuff at once and it's not clear, okay? So one thing I can tell you about this example is that this student started here, okay? They started with structure first. They had a really clear, you know, it was really clear exactly what they were saying, how they were saying it and everything like that, okay? And their first draft looked more like this than it did like the last piece, okay? It was actually the refinement of the piece that got them there, okay? So they, like I said, they didn't just write it overnight, okay? They wrote it in a very structured way. We talked a lot about it, what they wanted to say, was it clear? They refined their ideas. They got their draft in quite early. I reckon in kind of a 5-week or a 6-week process, they had their draft in week 2, and they spent 4 weeks going from here to down here. Yeah, that's the difference. It's not being a writing prodigy, it's being strategic and focused. Everyone cool on that?